Welcome to the Level Up Artist Podcast. We are your hosts, Adriana Amay and
Jackie Sanders. We are two art professionals sharing forward the advice and business lessons we have learned along our creative journeys.
We talk to artists, leaders, and art professionals to demystify the creative process and discover new ways to succeed as a career-minded artist.
If you find value in these conversations, please go ahead and subscribe. This will help other creatives like you find our podcast, and you will be notified when we drop a new episode every Tuesday.
So, on today's episode, something that is fresh in our minds, definitely for me in my creative practice, is a distraction or expansion. Look, sometimes it really feels as though you're falling into a rabbit hole. This is normal for creatives, by the way. You know, our minds are always exploring different topics, different things, but sometimes you feel like you really deep dive into maybe a new material, maybe a completely different artistic discipline, and it doesn't seem to have a direct connection to your work. And that's when you have to ask yourself, are you getting distracted by this new thing? Or is this leading into an expansion of your existing practice?
Exactly. And distractions aren't always a bad thing, right? It's really only if they're at a sacrifice to your larger creative vision, or you get stuck going down the rabbit hole in a million different directions and not finding the clarity and vision of what your long-term goal is. That's the only time when these explorations can veer into the side of distractions, because you're ultimately then potentially wasting time on things that don't tie in down the road together.
Yeah, and I've actually heard this from other artists too, which actually, comes out of that, where they may be taking a lot of different workshops and classes and things like that, which is great. You're adding tools to the toolbox, but then they're missing that time to actually develop their own work, right? So the distraction may be in the way of, I love learning, I want to learn new things, but I'm like a butterfly, just going from, plant to plant. And that definitely could read as a shiny object syndrome type thing. And it's taking you away from the work that you want to do. So it's really important, if you find yourself in this rabbit hole type situation, to consider whether or not the distraction may be a sign that you actually need a break from your usual work. Like maybe it's become a little bit of a routine. Maybe the body work you're creating has become a little boring, a little too easy. So is that where this is coming in? Maybe this is something you need in your own process to generate new ideas. And you have to have that pause, do something unrelated that will directly influence your work. It might indirectly, however, and that's your way of kind of feeding, right? Like what's inside of you. Or is it just that there's something so strongly that's resonating with you that you just can't pull away, right? Like, what's the level of, can I call it obsession? I'm gonna go with that. What's the level of obsession that's attached to this? Is this just a fling, or or is there something a little bit deeper going on? There's definitely a few questions you need to ask yourself about this.
Exactly. Especially when thinking about workshops, like you mentioned, we've talked about that on previous episodes as a great way to like reignite your creative vision or to try something new, get out of your comfort zone. But you're right. There is that assessment period that needs to happen of allocating time to just experiment, play, have no expectations, and see where this creative calling might be taking you with a new medium or some new aspect of your work. But then having that time of reassessment and asking yourself those very helpful questions of, am I doing this just because it's fun and new and shiny object syndrome, the honeymoon phase of a relationship, so to speak? Or am I constantly coming back to this idea, this motif throughout various chapters in my creative process? Maybe every couple of years, you find yourself commonly coming back to this thing. And if that's the case, is there a larger reason to it? And that's when that process of weaving it back into your creative process really needs to happen.
Yeah, and this can show up in many different ways. Like we're saying, like there's obviously different things that you can do to reignite. And obviously, if you've heard our podcast before, we talk about different things you can do to keep that creative engine running, some of which are slightly separate from what your normal practice is. But some some examples of how this might show up. You might be looking at new things, right? It might be a new discipline, like perhaps you are a painter and suddenly ceramics, guilty. Sculpture, guilty. Textiles or carving are what's calling out to you. It could be a new medium, watercolor, gouache, mineral pigments, alcohol markers. Like it could be completely different from what you normally do. Sometimes it's a little more subtle. It could be a new substrate. So maybe you usually work on canvas and now you're exploring what would your work look like if it was on wood panels, on plaster. What if the canvas was unstretched and just tacked onto the wall? Like, how does that change your process? So it doesn't have to be big and dramatic and completely different. Sometimes the difference is a little bit subtle, but worth looking into. Like, where are we going with this?
Exactly. And even for other things, it could be not just what you're working with physically. Maybe you're working in the same medium, but maybe it's a new motif or subject matter that you're exploring. So, new patterns or shapes. Maybe you're exploring symbols from different cultural influences, a social message that you really want to push in the concept of your work, because that's also putting you out of your comfort zone or making a new trail, so to speak, with your work, which is different from what your normal routine is. Even new techniques that you use to create your work. Maybe you're switching up your process of what elements or what colors in your palette you change to. That can also be differences that really make you more intentional with your creative process rather than what you're used to doing.
Yeah, just imagine if you're, let's say, you're in the business of making pet portraits. Nothing wrong with that, of course. But then suddenly you find yourself drawn to doing architectural drawings of bridges. I don't know,
Right.
right? So it's like, wait, they feel like they're two completely different worlds. So definitely worth exploring where some of this is coming from. Another way it shows up, again, it could be subtle, it could be a little bit more dramatic, is when the colors change. So maybe you normally work with cool colors and the warm ones are creeping up, or you work with vibrant colors and suddenly you're exploring a muted palette, or even more dramatic, you're going black and white for
Yeah.
someone who normally paints with every color of the rainbow. So that's another way that this can kind of pop up in your work.
Yeah. And one thing for me that I find that I love exploring in terms of being a beginner again in my process is changing a lot of these things, but always having the tie through of what my creative influences are. And so this is like what I find inspires me in my work, the concepts I'm exploring. But this may be something that as an artist, you want to completely shift to. So maybe there's a new topic that you're researching that you want to incorporate into your work. Maybe you've been journaling about new concepts, ideas, have had life experiences that impact the work that you make, and that inevitably will show itself in your work. Or diving into a specific source of inspiration, whether it be nature or a cityscape, and figuring out, okay, is this simply an interest of mine or is this a life event of mine that I'm working through? Or is this something I want to consciously bring over into my work and unpack in a creative language?
Yeah. And I feel like you'll get to a crossroads where you just got to sit down with yourself and say, okay, I need to actually differentiate. Is this a distraction slash new hobby slash new fun thing to do? Or is this actually signaling expansion in your existing work? So, a few things to look out for is if there are cohesive elements with your current work. So I'll give myself as an example. I've been dealing with ceramics and 3D and sculpture lately, just dabbling in at this point. Okay, maybe more like obsessed. That's the truth.
You're veering the level of being invested into it.
Yeah, it's
It's
going
become
there.
more than dabbling now, which is very exciting.
It is, and it turns into like, okay, what are the cohesive elements between what I'm trying to achieve with this new material, and how would that be reflected with my current 2D work, which is most of my body of work. And I do see cohesive elements between them. So it's not just, oh, I did this, fill in the blank, crochet or puzzle or carving, or I mean, it is whatever you want it to be, right? And it can be fine art too. I'm not saying crafts. Um, but like, how do they actually tie together in an exhibition? Could they sit next to each other, right? Like, that's where my brain goes. Another thing to kind of look into is what kind of time are you spending researching and developing this new direction? Not just playing. We all need to play and explore, but now you're going a little bit further with the research and development and going, okay, how do I make this happen? And again, how do I cohesify it with the rest of my work? Also, do you have that drive where you want all of it to be related to each other in some way, shape, or form? They may look very different at first, but do you have that drive to put them together? Or is this like, oh, I just did this weekend workshop and that's it? I may never do that type of technique or whatever again, right? And then also extremely important, I feel like, is it refilling the creative tank and ends up generating more ideas than you can possibly create in a lifetime, right? If you're just like suddenly like, wait, not just new ideas for whatever this new thing is, but also generating ideas for what you've been working on up until this point. So it's really interesting. And we've talked about it in a previous episode how you can take a class that's not related to your discipline, yet you can still take from it different ideas. Like maybe you take a cyanotype class. I'm going to give a quick example, right? Which is a type of photo printing process. And a lot of times you're dealing with negative images, the reverse of what you want to show. Well, that actually can translate into painting with negative shapes as well. So, even though they're completely different media, one can feed into the other without one of them turning into a straight up rabbit hole detour. It can actually go from one to the other. And that's where you have to determine, like, okay, are we going this way or is this just feeding the main thing, essentially?
Exactly. And when you're at that crossroads, I feel like you're saying there's that inevitable time of play and excitement with a new medium or a new style, but there will be that moment of a crossroads where you maybe feel pulled in two different directions or you've developed something enough to where it's piquing your interest. And that's really where that self-assessment and honesty has to come in. So being brutally honest with yourself and seeing, okay, can I see this turning into anything serious? Do I feel that energy of I'm not only having this one new idea for this one piece, it unlocked 50 new ideas and I just cannot wait to get started. So consider whether this is just a fun detour. And maybe if that is the case, you had fun doing it during this workshop or during this set couple of weeks exploring it. Take it for what it is, pull from it what you can, and then you can move on. Because realistically, in our creative journey, we only do have so much time, especially when it comes to actually making the work. If you're looking to turn your business or turn your art into a business or a career. So really trying to balance that time that you spend creating your normal work with this new expansion, and then kind of giving yourself a cutoff time. Maybe there's a specific date or a specific point in that creative process that you say, okay, by this point, I need to decide what I'm doing here. You can't stay in the gray area limbo forever.
No, you're 100% right. And we've talked about this before, the idea of what do you want to be known for? So that might be a little bit scary to think about, but it's more like, okay, do you want to be known for just doing this one very specific thing? Whatever those parameters look like, or do you want to give yourself permission to expand on that definition? So it's not just like, Adriana's known for doing abstract flowers. I'm making it up, right? And that's all I
Right.
do. And that's the end of it. Or Adriana likes to do flowers in 2D and 3D. I don't know. And they
Right.
fan landscapes and whatnot, but they're still unifying things where it's like, okay, that is a style, right? And they all carry.
Yeah.
It's like an example I like to think about is Picasso. He did a lot of stuff. Did you all know
Yeah.
that Picasso did pottery too? What? I'm sorry, what? And you look at it and you're just like, yeah, it's the same guy. Like, at least I think it looks like it's still the same guy. But it's giving yourself that permission to look at it. But like Jackie said, also have the time to assess and say, okay, I haven't painted or whatever your discipline is in X amount of time. Is this feeding it so that I can go back to that? Are we actually switching completely? Like, Is
Which is
this what
okay too. Yeah. If you
yeah,
find that, you know what, this is something I truly want to expand upon and this old style I don't necessarily connect with, that is also an okay shift in your journey. But if
yeah,
you realize, oh, this is just a shiny
just
object
a hobby.
distraction because I want to make acrylic paintings, but I just spent 3 weeks perfecting a sticker design that I only plan on having available for a month, then
Mhm,
like, is it worth the distraction, so to
mhm,
speak, in your
mhm.
creative development? But having you talk about your recent pottery exploration, which I have loved watching because we have community facing studios in downtown Raleigh, and my studio is just a walk down the hallway away. So I get to see the day by day evolution of it, which is so much fun. Of course, my marketing brain goes to, when do you share your experiments with others? So I'm curious what that looks like for you.
So it's really scary at first, honestly, because you go into, again, is this a distraction? I would err on the side of not sharing it too early.
Yeah.
I tend not to share at first, except maybe in person, because again, public facing. So people are going to see that I'm doing like experiments with ceramics and like different paint swatches and things on clay.
Yeah. They walk into your studio and you have like 2 tables of clay tests and studies. Like, what is
Yeah,
that? And you're like, it's nothing. I'm not doing anything.
nothing.
Hide
Yeah,
it behind a sheet.
yeah.
Don't worry about
Private
it.
eyes only. Yeah, top
It's kind of
secret.
hard to hide when you're in a public facing studio, which is the fun part of it, really demystifying the creative process. But the good, the
Yeah.
bad, the experiments that turned into nothing, the beginnings of a new series, people see it all.
Yeah, they do. So I tend, unless they walk in or happen to ask about it, I tend just to say, oh, they're just experiments and kind of leave it at that.
Mm.
I may or may not share sneak peeks on Instagrams if I'm feeling bold about it, if something's like exciting me. But generally, I want to savor that beginner mindset where you're just like, ooh, what about this? Ooh, what about that? Ooh,
Yeah.
like I don't want to have that pressure to explain how the new direction relates to the usual work, or having to say, if somebody were to ask, which has already happened, so you're doing ceramics now? Are you not painting anymore? And I'm like, oh no, here we go.
Because
Yes,
it
I'm
also
still painting. That's
it
that's my
also
game. It's in
it
my blood.
also forces you to make that decision too, though. Like whether you do decide to go completely in a new direction, or like you might not know yet how they cohesively will merge. It may take another week, another month of evolving this expansion and to realize how they bridge together. So that's another thing. Like also you answering questions from people forces you to make decisions that maybe you haven't made yet, which can be good, but also can be bad.
And even though if it's forcing you the decision, you don't have to tell them, by the way, at all.
True.
So you could leave that part of the dialogue internal. I sure do, at least for the most part. Although I did have a recent discussion, as of the time of this recording, in which a new collector was asking me how it related to the work, specifically to the painting that she was acquiring. And I just kind of shared ideas with her. I was like, honestly, I'm going to be candid with you. I don't know, but here's some things of how I see this relating to each other. And she was like, I can't wait to see it come to life. And I'm
Oh,
like, thank you. That was really sweet. But it took a while in conversation before I felt comfortable enough to share that. I'm not
right.
screaming that, off the rooftops of like, I'm trying something new. Because honestly, I don't know if it's gonna work. It took a long time for me to find my painting style.
Mhm.
Ceramics are a whole nother bag of chips. I mean,
Yeah.
and they're not as what's the word I'm looking for? Painting, I feel like you can make decisions faster, and if you make a mistake, you can fix it faster.
Right.
If it comes to it, speed is of concern, of course, and depending what medium you're using, of course, et cetera, et cetera. But when it comes to ceramics, there's a lot of things that are outside of your control, like the kiln. They joke about the kiln gods. Are they going to smile favorably upon you? Something might explode in the kiln. And there are so many other factors, and there's a lot of science behind it. It's very nerdy for a lot of it, of like ratios and formulas, which actually goes well with my personality because I am that person that makes formulas for my color, for my paint.
Right. But
So
there's
there's
so much experimenting and like an education on your part which is
is.
fun and exciting, but it is time consuming. And
It is.
so,
And
mhm.
there's people that have been doing ceramics for, 20 years and they'll still have things that explode in the kiln. So they're like, you just have to let it go and see what happens. And they've been doing this professionally for a long time. So me coming as a newbie into it, I'm like, I really don't want to set high expectations for
Right.
myself. I'm just going to experiment. Now, will this tie in? I've already been in this rabbit hole long enough that I know, yes, I am committed to it and making it part of my practice. How it will show up finally, who knows? To be determined.
Right.
Podcast episode in the future about this, but definitely, like you were saying, having that moment of, okay, how deep are we going into this one? How much are we investing in these materials and related things and workshops and videos and mhm.
Right. And I think that's the biggest thing for me when thinking about both. You were talking a lot about like sharing in person and, of course, having a day job in digital marketing. My first thought is, okay, well, when are you going to do your hard announcement on your newsletter or on social media or write a
Yeah,
blog post about it? And I think that really does come back to the, okay, what's your commitment level at this point? Because, of course, as business owners, we're in charge of our own business. We can change our mind. We can say that we're going to launch a product series on this day. And then if something happens, change the day. Sure. But I always have that mindset of like, once you announce it to the world, then it's pretty set in stone. Like that's something that I value of, okay, if I say I'm going to have a newsletter going out on this day, it's going out on this day. Of course, things happen, factors change, but especially when it comes to experiments, I have that same apprehension that you do of like, I want to really just like shelter it from the world for a while, not forever by any means, but really make sure that, okay, for me, when I'm starting this series or a concept or an experiment, it's really deeply rooted in my thoughts and things that I want to explore. So I want to make sure there's no outside influences on that series until I'm ready to answer all of those questions, or I've thought about those questions beforehand. Because I've 100% done that where I make one piece, it's kind of like an offshoot piece. Maybe I made it in a weekend or a week or even a month long. And once it's done, I share it because I'm so excited about it. And then 2 days later, share it on social media, that is. And then 2 days later, I'm like, you know what? Like for me, the magic is gone to this process, or like this piece was a concept that I wanted to explore, but it like started and ended with this one piece and now I'm on to the next thing. But then
mhm.
people keep asking about it and they're going to ask if you do more in that series, which is a great problem to have. But you kind of have to think about, okay, if this is what one person will see about my work, are you okay with if someone asked you to make a commission based on that piece? If someone wanted to order 10 of them that are in the similar series, like would that excite you? Or would you be like, ooh, man, I'm like committed to doing this for the next year, even though that's obviously not the case. But really making sure that you're ready to share that with the world.
Yeah, absolutely. I was just thinking something too as you were talking about the one and gone. We've talked about creating series of works, but I did just think of something else idea wise. If you're like taking the workshop, you feel like, this could lead somewhere, definitely talk to your artist friends, your close ones. If you go to crit groups or you have a close group of friends, especially if any of them work in that discipline that you are exploring, technique, etc. Maybe talk to them about it and maybe they could give you some tips, ideas. Maybe you could do materials exchange, to be honest, and save yourself some money. um it could be a way also for you to kind of discuss where you think this is going. And a lot of times, believe it or not, they'll say, oh, I can totally see how you're going to make this your own style. And they'll support you along the journey. Or they may just call you out friendly and lovingly way and say, like, I'm not sure, and help you ask the kind of questions that will help you decide, are you just, like we said, and we said it a couple times, the shiny object syndrome, are you just maybe avoiding a little bit working on your own
Right.
work on developing your own stuff because you're just having fun trying these other things, which again, they have a time and place, but sometimes you just gotta take a little bit of a distance from all that and then just have the assessment and go like, okay, where are you actually going with this? Because this is money that could be spent on supplies. So and time.
Exactly.
Really
Yeah.
good.
And having those people to really bounce those ideas off of is super, super helpful. We're all about community here on the podcast. But if you find that you don't have maybe those trusted people that you can reach out to, but especially if you're excited about the momentum or the potential of a piece or a series or an idea, I would really suggest that you start writing out, like, especially if you are very social media heavy with your business, craft social media posts as if you were announcing this piece. Maybe don't post them right away, but there's something about that creative energy and like wanting to share with the world that just doing like a brain download of your ideas or where you see the piece and series going, why you felt compelled to go in this direction, what you feel like it's satisfying, what you want to explore, and having that raw document of ideas will ultimately fuel potentially a future artist statement for this series, exploring how it really does tie back to your larger work. Because rather than people asking you those questions and you be more on the defense, you can really find clarity through writing out your concepts as the piece and the series develop into something bigger.
Yeah. And what you just mentioned, it reminded me, I heard this from another artist. They actually started a separate Instagram for some of their experiments because in their mind it was too different from their body of work and what their audience was into. So they actually started a separate Instagram with the idea of documenting their journey and thinking that later on, if it did turn into something completely serious, they maybe would put it together or actually keep them as separate businesses.
Yeah.
So definitely something to think
Oh,
about. But I like your idea about documenting. I've been taking some pictures, not much in video yet, but we know how reels
yeah.
is. Got to do.
Or even in
Uh,
like a blog post too, like
yeah,
sharing. And it
yeah,
can be something that, okay, you share with your newsletter subscribers once you're a few months into the exploration. And I mean, you can have a blog post that's super relevant to the growth of your creative process. And 6 months later, if you find that you don't really identify with that exploration anymore, it's no sweat off your back. You didn't make an entire new like profile gallery for it on your website.
exactly.
It's kind of like that middle ground of tiers of commitment, so to speak. Like it's
Yeah.
becoming more and more ingrained in your art journey.
Yeah, plus writing all that stuff out, it just kind of helps you articulate and formalize to a certain extent, even if nobody else sees it and you just do it on your phone in your notes app. But
Yeah.
it also helps cement the idea of how serious are we about this? Like, and it can be playful serious, but it's like as it relates to your art business, which is obviously what we talked to you all about, is like how does this tie in? So just a few parting words, so to speak, as we wrap this up, do give yourself permission, to explore new mediums, techniques, go take workshops, classes, learn new tools, like do all the things. All of this may feed into what your creative practice is, into what your artistic discipline is. Sometimes directly, it will feed in, sometimes indirectly. Either way, even as artists, we all need hobbies too. We all need ways to keep that creative engine, fed and going. So the only thing, of course, is just keep an eye out if this is happening all the time and it's always like something new, something shiny that just keeps distracting you away from your own work. Or maybe this is part of the way you do work and you actually need to rest in between larger bodies of work or series, and this is just how you do it. Just keep an eye out for like kind of how it shows up in your life. This may just be the way that you evolve and expand your way, but whichever one of those it turns out to be, obviously, again, we highly encourage you to at least explore it and enjoy the journey. I mean, that's what we're here for.
Exactly.
Yep. So with that, we're going to go ahead and wrap up this episode. And we really hope you enjoyed this conversation.
As always, our blog will be linked in the show notes where you can find episode notes, resources, and links to all of our other podcast episodes.
If you want to stay connected with us in between episodes and on social media, you can find us at all platforms, MMA Art.
I'm at J Sanders Studio across all platforms. And if you want to stay connected with the podcast, we are at Level Up Artists on Instagram. Thank you so much for listening. We'll talk to you next week.